Welcome to another big train tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. This week, we'll be taking a look at two icons of the Streamline era, Denver and Rio Grande Western diesel locomotives number 5771 and its in-service constant companion number 5762. Built in the 1950s to pull the famed California Zephyr passenger train, these graceful locomotives served on the Rio Grande system into the 1980s, long past the advent of Amtrak. Today, this colorful pair is proudly displayed at the museum, serving as a reminder of stylish passenger travel from Colorado's not too distant past. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Our subject, big trains, today are two brightly painted diesel-electric locomotives with a storied past. Although their entire service life was spent with just one railroad company, they became associated with three of the state's most widely recognized passenger trains, and they occasionally pulled other trains too. Let's step back in time now and examine the history of these graceful and stylish locomotives. Denver and Rio Grande Western locomotives 5771 and 5762 both date from 1955. Ordered from Builder Electromotive, a division of General Motors, they were part of a larger order for 6 Model F9 diesel-electric units total. These locomotives were intended to pull the California Zephyr passenger train, which operated over the Rio Grande's Moffett Tunnel route as it's made its way between Chicago and Oakland, California. The California Zephyr had its origins in 1939, when a triumvirate of the Western Pacific, Denver and Rio Grande Western, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy railroads jointly launched a new passenger train named the Exposition Flyer. The primary purpose of this train was to transport passengers to the Golden Gate International Exposition in San Francisco from Chicago. This World's Fair event celebrated the completion of the new San Francisco to Oakland and Golden Gate bridges. Interestingly, the Exposition Flyer turned out to be popular with passengers, and demand continued even after the exposition itself closed in 1940. At first made up of conventional steel heavyweight passenger cars and pulled by steam locomotives, this train would feature diesel locomotives and finally streamlined passenger cars in the years following World War II. But the real news came in 1949, when the three partner railroads announced that an all-new train would replace the Exposition Flyer. This new train would be named the California Zephyr. The California Zephyr was an eye-catcher, made of sleek stainless steel with fluted sides and featuring several observation domes for passengers. The entire matching train set gleamed. The three partner railroads jointly purchased the train sets, and each railroad acquired new locomotives to pull the Zephyr across its portion of the route. The Denver and Rio Grande Western proudly purchased dozens of Electromotive Model F7 streamlined diesel-electric locomotives in 1949. These would pull the Zephyr as well as other Rio Grande passenger trains, which were also being modernized and dieselized at this same time. The earliest commercially successful diesel-electric locomotives were produced in the U.S. in the 1920s. Their horsepower ratings were quite low, and they were limited to slow-speed switching in specialized locations where steam locomotives could not be used. As early as 1934, however, a diesel engine was used to power the Burlington's very first Pioneer Zephyr streamlined passenger train set. Streamlined trains pulled by diesels were soon introduced on other U.S. railroads, including the Santa Fe and the Union Pacific. By the late 1930s, locomotive builder Electromotive had rolled out production versions of locomotive models that would become widely used throughout the U.S. These graceful, streamlined locomotives came in two primary forms: 6-axle E-units and their 4-axle cousins in the F-unit series. The 6-axle E-units were intended for passenger service. At first, the 4-unit Fs were intended solely for freight service. However, it soon became clear that for railroads in mountainous territory, the 4-axle F units were a more practical choice. With all their weight on powered axles, the F units could pull heavier trains up steeper grades. In contrast, E units had 2 unpowered axles, and they were also geared for speed rather than slower speed pulling power. The F unit, in its many variations, would become the single most popular locomotive model as America's railroads rushed to dieselize following World War II. Over 7,500 were built between 1939 and 1960. F units became the standard power, pulling the Santa Fe's famed Super Chief and the railroad's other streamlined trains. They could also be found leading the California Zephyr between Oakland and Salt Lake City over the rails of the Western Pacific Railroad. The Burlington route, which operated the California Zephyr between Chicago and Denver, used a combination of both E and F units, given its flatter grade profile. The Denver and Rio Grande Western became a large purchaser of F units beginning in the early 1940s. Eventually, the railroad owned over 80 of the popular F7 model. In the mid-1950s, when it wanted to purchase several more for service, a new model, the F9, had come into production. While similar in outward appearances, the new model featured a higher horsepower rating and a number of other improvements over the earlier F7. Our 2 subject locomotives are both Model F9s, completed in 1955 at Electromotive's LaGrange, Illinois works. Locomotive number 5771 is what's known as an A unit, equipped with an operating cab and a stylish, streamlined nose on one end. Number 5762 is what's known as a B unit, meant to be coupled behind an A unit to provide additional tractive effort to pull a train. In service, additional B units, and sometimes A units too, could be added to create an even more powerful multi-unit locomotive set for pulling longer and heavier trains. The California Zephyr continued operating into the 1960s as the railroad industry was declining due to competition from trucks and jet aircraft. Passenger trains were in very real trouble, and the U.S. would soon create Amtrak as a quasi-governmental means of maintaining a nationwide passenger rail network. But before this could happen, the Western Pacific Railroad applied for permission to stop running the Zephyr over its portion of the route. The California Zephyr, as a through Chicago to the Pacific train, made its final run in March 1970. The Rio Grande elected to continue running its portion, and thus a somewhat similar train began operating between Denver and Salt Lake City. Using equipment from its predecessor train, this reborn daytime-only service was named the Rio Grande Zephyr. As Amtrak was being formed in 1971, this new entity wanted to route one of its long-distance trains over the Rio Grande's tracks between Denver and Salt Lake City. The railroad objected to this because of concerns that Amtrak service levels might be increased at a later date. Ultimately, the Rio Grande decided not to join Amtrak. Instead, it continued to operate its Rio Grande Zephyr passenger train. Amtrak had no choice but to route its San Francisco Zephyr to the north via the Union Pacific's overland route. For the next 12 years, the Rio Grande Zephyr proudly operated 3 days weekly in each direction between Denver and Salt Lake City, but never on Wednesdays. Friendly service and delicious food remained the norm through the years. Since it was no longer an overnight trip, sleeping cars were not part of the consist. But as financial losses mounted for the train, the Denver and Rio Grande Western finally threw in the towel. The Rio Grande Zephyr, the very last non-Amtrak intercity train still operating at that time in the U.S., completed its final run in April of 1983. Amtrak promptly rerouted its San Francisco Zephyr onto the Rio Grande's tracks and renamed it the California Zephyr. The train continues operating to this day. With the Rio Grande Zephyr now gone, locomotives 5771 and 5762 were out of a job, almost. They saw limited freight service, and they were also pressed into service pulling the 1984 ski train between Denver and Winter Park. Along with one other surviving F9B unit, number 5763, the locomotives made their final run in the fall of that same year. With their retirements, over 4 decades of F-unit operations on the Rio Grande came to a close. Following retirement, all 3 surviving Rio Grande F9 locomotives were stored at the Rio Grande's Burnham shops in Denver. They remained in storage following the railroad's merger with Southern Pacific in 1988. Finally, in 1996, as Southern Pacific was preparing to merge with Union Pacific Railroad, locomotives 5771 and 5762 were donated to the Colorado Railroad Museum by SP. The 2 locomotives were moved to the Coors Brewery Complex in Golden, where they were graciously stored for a time. Trucking was finally arranged for their move to the Colorado Railroad Museum's property. There, they were unloaded onto a specially built track and soon joined by 2 passenger cars to create a short but stylish train set for display. Today, these 2 locomotives are painted in their as-delivered livery and posed in the museum rail yard. These colorful locomotives remain an iconic example of the stylish years of streamlined passenger travel in the United States. The train they lead includes a streamlined combination baggage coach that once served on the California and Rio Grande Zephyrs and also the Rio Grande ski train. Bringing up the rear is a rounded observation lounge from the Santa Fe's Train of the Stars, the Super Chief. Here in Colorado especially, these trains showcase the beauty and allure of the Rocky Mountain West to travelers from all over the U.S. and the world. Their legacy continues with Amtrak today. There's one final interesting side note to this story. In 1950, a year after the California Zephyr debuted, the Denver and Rio Grande Western partnered with General Motors in erecting a monument to the streamlined dome cars used on the California Zephyr. The monument stood outside Glenwood Springs, just west of the entrance to Glenwood Canyon. As the story goes, a GM vice president was so moved by the view as he was riding through the canyon that he came up with the idea of the dome cars that the Zephyr would go on to become famous for. Today, this monument is proudly displayed at the Colorado Railroad Museum. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed our tour of these 2 Denver and Rio Grande Western streamlined diesel-electric locomotives. I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collections.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.